Hi, this is Professor James Rivera, and this is Literature and Writing, Gene 2312. Today we're going to be reviewing 3 poems that were assigned for week number 14. These are My Last Duchess by Robert Browning, The Ruined Maid by Thomas Hardy, and When I Was 1 in 20 by A. Housman. Just recently we talked about Robert Browning's My Last Duchess. We're going to very briefly go over that poem once again today. So that just to review some of the finer points. We're not going to go into reading the poem. This was a homework assignment. However, some of the things that I want to review with you are the terminology pertaining to speaker, stanza, line, rhyme, rhythm, tone, diction, and symbolism. We talked about the concept speaker in comparison to fiction. When we talk about the person who narrates a story in fiction, we use the concept narrator. We talked about first person, second person, and third person. In a poem, it's different. The poem does not necessarily narrate a story. However, in My Last Duchess, the poem reads somewhat like a story, or it has a storyline. It has somewhat of a plot, but this is not customary in all poetry. So the voice that we read within a poem is what we refer to as a speaker. In the case of this poem, we can identify clearly whom the speaker is. In this case, we have the speaker being the Duke, right? The Duke who's talking to an interlocutor who happens to be an emissary that comes on behalf of a count, and he's explaining this painting that he has on a wall, a portrait of his, whom we arrive at the conclusion is his late wife. And that's why the poem's title is My Last Duchess. We don't think it's going to be the last woman he marries because, as a matter of fact, he's telling his interlocutor that he wants to have the count's daughter's hand in marriage. Now, it's very interesting that throughout the poem we get this idea of who this narrator, right, the speaker I should say, is. The Duke, we get this clear notion of his characteristics. He's this manipulative, authoritarian, self-centered, narcissistic individual who wants to possess his wife, or he sees his wife, I should say, as a possession, as a mere object. So he objectifies the woman within the poem, and we arrive at the conclusion that he had her killed because he suspected that she was being unfaithful to him. So in that sense, this takes us to the tone. The tone of the poem is one which we can say is somewhat morbid or dark. The tone is how it is that the individual is speaking. Right? So when you say, I don't like the tone that so-and-so was using as he or she was addressing me, what you're saying is you were able to pick up on a certain feeling regarding how it is that the person was speaking. So the same thing is what we should be doing when we're reading a poem. We should be able to determine what the speaker sounds like. So there's a certain hint of irony, maybe sarcasm, but the tone is, in a general sense, within this poem, we could say authoritarian. This speaker is projecting himself as one who wants to overpower the individuals that surround him. And the fifth term within this screen is diction. Diction is the author's choice of words. When we consider Theodore Rothke's My Papa's Waltz, we said that the words that were chosen within that poem led us astray in terms of our interpretation of the poem. Words such as whiskey, words such as tapped, caked, hard by dirt, beat. These types of words within that poem led us to think that the poem was about domestic violence when it really was not. Now, within this poem, notice that the language is very formal. In some cases, it seems very dense, right? Shakespearean even. So Many of the terms that are used there are very refined, but almost archaic. A lot of it is lost, right, in definition to us, but we have to go back and read it very carefully to be able to understand what the storyline within the poem is. And last but not least, within this list of words, we have the word symbolism, and we defined this the other day, and that's why I'm rushing just a little. It refers to how it is that we use something, an object, for instance, within a poem or any work of literature for that matter, to mean something beyond what is literal. When we considered Young Goodman Brown, the ribbons, we said, were symbolic. The names are symbolic because beyond being individuals' names, they have a meaning which is implicit in these names. It's implied, right? We have to arrive at the conclusion. The serpent staff in Young Goodman Brown is a good example of a symbol. I mean, it symbolizes evil, darkness, right? The devil himself. The forest within Young Goodman Brown is another symbol. In Good Country People, the hollow Bible is a very important symbol, which talks about vanity or the emptiness or the facade that people assume when trying to project themselves as being religious individuals, so to be able to manipulate others. In A Clean Well Lighted Place, possibly the changing of the Our Father's prayer may be a symbolic way of presenting a social criticism. So here, when we talk about My Last Duchess by Robert Browning, we could say that a very important symbol is the portrait. The portrait itself of his wife is a symbol of how it is that he wants to possess his wife, how he sees her as an object. He draws curtains upon the portrait, meaning he is the one, he's the master, and he is the owner of that portrait, and therefore of his Duchess, of the Duchess. So we talked about figurative language, and these are concepts that I had mentioned before. We would not necessarily define one by one. Many of them you're familiar with. However, you have access to the presentation, and you could very well search for these terms. Some of them are very common to you, such as simile and metaphor. These are comparisons within a work of literature, particularly in poetry. They're used very much. One, simile, is a direct comparison. When you're saying, you're using expressions such as like or as, right? Her eyes were as bright as the sun, or as bright as stars. Her eyes were like stars. So here you're making this direct comparison. Yet a metaphor is a very common figure of speech. We use these very often in everyday speech. When you refer to a person as being as strong as an oak, that's a simile, but he's an elephant. He remembers everything. So here you're making this indirect comparison, therefore metaphor. Personification, when you give human attributes to things that are not human. A hyperbole is when you're making this exaggeration. Now, synecdoche, metonymy, I want you to look those up on your own to see if you can come up with examples, right? These are very similar, and it's necessary for you to see the specific examples so that you can see the difference between these imagery. When you have allusions to elements that you can perceive with your senses, hearing, seeing, even movement, right? So this is what we refer to as imagery. When the work of literature is providing hints at colors, things that you see, this is imagery. An oxymoron is an expression that uses contrasting figures to define one same thing. Opposites sometime. When you say icy hot, right? This burning cold. So you have contrasting images, sometimes opposing images or ideas to within one same concept. That's what we refer to as an oxymoron. So in my last lectures, I'm not going to stop here because we talked about this during our previous meeting. Important that you consider the literary devices being used there, the irony, you pick up on the sarcasm being used by the speaker. These are just some themes that we can pick up on here. Jealousy, which is, of course, something that we can pick up on the speaker's perception of his wife. He even hired a monk, right? Fra Pandolf. We said Fra was a title, religious title, belonging to the clergy within the church. He hired this individual because, of course, he had a vote of celibacy. So his wife would not be unfaithful to him with a monk. And still, he hints at the fact that the monk, Fra Pandolf, would have said something so to make his wife blush. The oppression of women is underscored within the poem. Chauvinism. We use this term to refer to machismo, right? So chauvinism comes from the French. It's basically a last name. What is said is that there was this French soldier whose last name was Chauvin. He was a nationalist, and he considered everything French to be better than anything else. From there, the term chauvinism or chauvinism was coined. And in that sense, we tend to refer to male chauvinism as the idea or the notion of trying to portray everything male as being better or superior. And in this case, when we consider gender studies or politics or sexual politics, we refer to male chauvinism as the idea of individuals who consider themselves to be better than women because of their sex. So the concept machismo has been accepted as a Spanish expression borrowed, or an expression borrowed from Spanish in English. So it's acceptable. We talked about tone, and the atmosphere is related to tone, which is the general feeling that you can pick up on as you're reading a work of literature. This takes us to the second poem that you were supposed to have considered, The Ruined Maid. I'm going to transfer this poem to here. Hopefully you're able to see this. So I'm going to read through it very quickly. The Ruined Maid by Thomas Hardy. O Melia, my dear, this does everything crown. Who would have supposed I should meet you in town? And whence such fair garments, such prosperity? Oh, didn't you know I'd been ruined, said she. Different from Robert Browning's My Last Duchess, Thomas Hardy's The Ruined Maid is a dialogue. We said that Robert Browning's My Last Duchess is a soliloquy or a dramatic monologue. Right? One of the most famous dramatic monologues that I'm sure that you may have heard of, even if you may just know one line, is in Hamlet. To be or not to be, that is the question, right? That expression has become very famous. It comes from a dramatic monologue or a soliloquy expressed by Hamlet himself within the Shakespearean play. So the same thing happens in My Last Duchess. The entire poem is the Duke speaking to another person, but the other person doesn't say anything. It's just the Duke speaking. So it's a soliloquy. In Thomas Hardy's poem, what we have is a dialogue of sorts. You have this young woman or these two young women who apparently grew up together possibly or lived in the same town. You have one who moves to the city, and one day she's encountered by the other who still lives in the countryside. And the young woman from the country, or the woman from the country, upon seeing her uh, old neighbor, whose name happens to be Amelia, or Emilia maybe, she expresses her admiration. And that's what we see in each of the stanzas. And the last line always refers to what it is that Emilia possibly answers. So this first stanza, the woman from the country, she's observing her clothing, her physical appearance, and she's questioning, how did you come to be this way? And Emilia, she answers using an expression which is used in an ironical manner throughout the entire poem. She says, "Oh, didn't you know I'd been ruined?" said she. So Hardy here is playing with the concept of ruin. When we talk about ruin, we tend to think of wealth. A person who has been ruined is bankrupt. But here you have something which is ironical, because even though she says she's ruined, she seems to have wealth, because that's what you can perceive from her physical appearance and how she speaks, which leads us to have to evaluate the concept ruin from another aspect, from another perspective. Notice that the title is The Ruined Maid, and this is a mid or late 19th century poem. So the concept maid doesn't mean a person who works in domestic affairs, right? She's not a maid, a person who cleans the house and does domestic chores. The concept maid here is an archaic form of referring to a young woman. So we have to ask ourselves, how would the concept of ruin be associated to a young woman during the mid or late 19th century? It is very possible that it refers to how it is that society sees her for what she is doing, or how she presents herself to others. Let's continue going over the poem, and that way I don't ruin the concept ruin, or your interpretation of the concept ruin, for you. You left us in tatters, without shoes or socks, tired of digging potatoes and spudding up docks. And now you've gay bracelets and bright feathers 3. Yes, that's how we dress when we're ruined, said she. At home in the Barton, you said thee and thou, and thickoon and therezoon and vader, but now you're talking quite fits for high company. Some polish is gained with one's ruin, said she. Your hands were like paws then, your face blue and bleak, but now I'm bewitched by your delicate cheek, and your little gloves fit as on any lady. We never do work when we're ruined, said she. You used to call home life a hag-ridden dream, and you'd sigh and you'd sock, but at present you seem to know not of megrims or melancholy. True, one's pretty lively when ruined, said she. I wish I had feathers, a fine sweeping gown, and a delicate face, and could strut about town, my dear. A raw country girl such as you be cannot quite expect that. You ain't ruined, said she. So here you have this shift. Each of these stanzas begins with Emilia's interlocutor observing her apparent wealth and expressing her admiration. And every stanza ends with Emilia underscoring the fact that the way that you arrive at her present condition is via ruin. However, the last stanza, we notice that Emilia uses the concept or the expression ain't, which breaks away from the formal way, her formal register. And she continues to underscore, she finishes underscoring the fact that her interlocutor cannot aspire to be at the point her present wealth condition because she's not ruined. So I don't want to ruin your interpretation of the concept ruin, but it does have to do with how it is that society will perceive for a young woman to be in a good social stature or not based on her decisions. She used to live in the countryside. Now we see her in town. She's all by herself, and she is well dressed. She is apparently very wealthy. She doesn't say that she's married, but she does have money. And we're talking about the mid 19th century, where the condition, the social condition of women was not one that was in parity, right, with men. Still to this date, we're living the 21st century, and we still have some work to do in terms of fighting for the equality between the sexes, or struggling for this. So imagine mid 19th, late 19th century, what the situation of women was. So we may have further discussion regarding this later on, so that you can react before I provide a clearer interpretation of what it is that this poem is about. Okay? And the last poem assigned for week number 14 was When I Was 1 in 20 by A.E. Housman. However, I have the presentation on The Ruined Maid. Here are just some concepts. The theme, the themes are values, gender roles, perspective. Right? What are women expected to do within society? That's what we refer to as gender roles. How it is that we define the activities that are socially acceptable on behalf of men and women. Can we see this? Can we interpret this within Thomas Hardy's poem? What do you perceive? However, we talk about perspective within the poem and how it is portrayed. We have two women speaking to each other. The perspective that they each has regarding ruin is important here. So this was the assignment that you had for that week and for this week, for week number 5. So I want to quickly go over When I Was 1 in 20. And I'm trying to cover as much as I can in as little time as I can so that you can benefit from a brief recording. However, you know that I'm available during my office hours, or you can email me your questions. That way we can work asynchronically. So, When I Was 1 in 20, 2 stanzas, right? And I went briefly over this poem last week. When I was 1 in 20, I heard a wise man say, give crowns and pounds and guineas, but not your heart away. Give pearls away and rubies, but keep your fancy free. But I was 1 in 20. No use to talk to me. When I was 1 in 20, I heard him say again, the heart out of the bosom was never given in vain. 'Tis paid with sighs aplenty, and sold for endless rue. And I am 2 in 20, and oh, 'tis true, 'tis true. So A. Housman is talking about matters of the heart. Notice he talks about this individual who approaches a speaker providing wisdom. And here we have to ask ourselves what wisdom is, right? We have to try to define wisdom. Wisdom is not the same thing as intelligence. To be intelligent, well, everyone is intelligent, right? We're living in a time when within pedagogy we talk about multiple intelligences. You may not be very good at math or science or even history for that matter. However, you may be great at crocheting, or you may be fantastic at sports. You may be a good listener. You may play an instrument. So these are different types of intelligence. You may be a great cook. So that's another form of intelligence. So in the broadest of senses, to be intelligent is to be able to perform regarding a particular aspect of, and here I'm ranting philosophical, of existence in a manner which is average or above average to the to any other individual in comparison within society. So intelligence is very broad. However, when we talk about wisdom, wisdom is to be able to apply the knowledge acquired regarding a particular facet of life, and many times this comes with experience, or it's usually associated with experience. To be ignorant is to not know. So we know that the concept ignorance is associated to the individual insofar as the individual has no experience regarding a pertaining any given aspect or facet of life. Here, Housman is talking about matters of the heart. Right? When we're young, we tend to be impulsive. And we can hear our mothers and fathers when we have responsible parents speaking in the back of our heads. No te juntes con fulano. No me cae bien sutano. You have to be very careful. You don't want you to be heartbroken. So this wise man is talking to the speaker and saying, look, crowns, pounds, guineas, these are forms of currency, wealth. It's better to give things that are physical, material, rather than give your heart, which is, don't become involved romantically. Don't fall in love, is what the wise man is saying. Be very careful with how it is that you interact with others, because this is something that could lead to getting you hurt. And the stanza ends with a coordinating conjunction, right? The word but. Contrast. However, nevertheless, notwithstanding, yet. That's the contrast. I was given good advice by this wise person. However, the contrast is I was 1 in 20. And no use to talk to me. Why no use? Well, he was wasting his time is what he's saying, because I was so inexperienced and my youth led me to be impulsive. I thought I knew more than anyone else. You have to conclude all of this, right? Read between the lines. And the second stanza is what happened because of not taking the advice. 1 year elapsed, and the wise man said the same thing. The heart out of the bosom was never given in vain. 'Tis paid with sighs of plenty and sold for endless rue. And now I'm 22. And oh, 'tis true. Meaning now I know better. Why? Because now I have the experience, but this experience came at a cost, right? It came at a price. And the price was, now that I've had my heart broken, now I know better. So the speaker of this poem had to go through a very difficult experience in matters of the heart to be able to understand that it's preferable to give that which is material away because you know the price. But when it's something abstract, when it's something having to do with your feelings, it's a much higher price. You never know exactly how you're going to feel until you go through the experience. All right, so these 3 poems were assigned for week number 4. I'm going to end this presentation here. That way you can study it at your leisure and go over it as many times as you deem necessary. I'll be recording the poems for week number 5, and I'll be posting them as well later on. So have a great day. Hopefully, if you have questions, I'll be receiving them via email, and I'll do my best to answer as promptly as I can. Have a good one, and enjoy poetry. Bye-bye.